Hello everybody, Michael Wolf back again with another video. Today we're going to talk about acing your accessories with the dumbbell row. So I was doing some dumbbell rows during my workout today, and this idea to make this video popped up into my head because I was doing them a certain way that was a little bit different than the way I did them for a workout a few weeks ago. And I thought to myself, what gives me the kind of leeway to do them so differently and still call it good, still call it correct, compared to the way I low bar squat, which I try to do the same every single workout. Now, of course, there are variations, right? I might do a pause lift one time or a tempo lift a different time. I sometimes do high bar squats. I sometimes do safety bar squats. But when I do a regular, well, what some people would call a competition variant low bar squat, I try to do it the exact same every time. When I do dumbbell row, I will do it differently sometimes, and I'll illustrate that later exactly what I mean by that. And it kind of got me thinking on this path where I think the closer something is to a main lift, to a primary lift, which would be the squat, the bench press, the deadlift, and the press, primarily for strength. The closer you are to one of those things, the less variation there is in what is correct. Now, that doesn't mean there's no variation. There is, but there's less variation. The narrower the window of what would be considered good form, correct way to do it. Those variations exist for a variety of reasons within that smaller window. It could be a variation between different people's body parts, their anthropometry, their limb length differences. Now, that variation is not endless because the differences between people are not that great, right? Nobody has an 80%, nobody has their leg 80% tibia and 20% femur. As far as I know, that has never existed. Nobody has an arm that's 90% humerus and only 10% radius and ulna. So the differences in variation between person to person that might change the back angle, the stance width, the toe angle are not that great, but they do exist. There's more than one. We can't just say stand at this thing, this width with this angle and this back angle. We can say this is where the most people generally fit in, but it will vary a little bit person to person. And even within a given person, you might find slight differences over the course of your lifting career. Maybe as you gain more weight, you might take a little bit of a wider stance to have room for yourself. Some people who go into more competitive powerlifting might widen their stance to shorten the range of motion. Maybe they find they can lift more weight that way because it accesses the muscles that they have stronger. So if you're training for general strength, we want to include all of the muscle groups to the greatest extent possible. Whereas if you're training for a competitive variant, you might just want to do the way that allows you to lift the most weight, even if one of the muscles is slightly undertrained in that variant. So there's ways to do it differently that are still correct, but that window expands further the more you get away from being a main lift. So something like a dumbbell row, which is not only not a main lift, it's not even a supplemental lift, it's not even a variation of a main lift like a pause squat is for a squat, like close grip benches for a bench. It's not even a variation of a main lift. It's an accessory lift which we do specifically to develop certain body parts. In this case, primarily the lats in the row. It will work the biceps too, it'll work the rear delts too, etc. But primarily we're doing rows for back, for lats. So the thought occurred to me, why I do these rows differently sometimes, whereas when I'm trying to do a low bar squat, I generally try to do it the same every time. So why do I justify that to myself? Am I just fooling myself, or is it legit? And I thought about it and I thought it was legit. So I wanted to make a little video about it. So today we'll talk about acing your accessories with the dumbbell row. Some of the different ways to do it right, and it won't be an exhaustive list, it's just be some examples. Some of the different ways that are correct to do it right, and illustrating some examples that are not correct. Because even though the window opens the further away you get from those main lifts, the more of a window you have to do it differently in different ways and still be correct, there are still some ways that we don't want to do, generally speaking. So let's start looking at these and see if we can kind of analyze some of the different correct ways to do it, and also talk about the ways that I don't recommend doing it, or at least not for most people. At one of my work sets today, my first work set with the left arm, this is 135 pounds for a set of 10. And let me just turn the sound off here so I can talk over it. What you'll see here is I do a kind of medium version of the lift where I do use some body English, but not what I consider an excessive amount. So these are not strict rows, which is one of the things we'll talk about coming up. One of the other variations, ways to do it, where you can do it strictly or you can do it from a dead stop. You'll see I use both a stretch reflex and a little bit of body English. Let's take a look. It's just 10 reps. So I get myself set up. I'll point out I have a good brace on the bench, 2 points of contact with my knee here and my hand here, and my other leg here has to be sufficiently back out of the way. From this angle, you might not be able to see it, but if my leg is too close up here, I'll bang into it with a dumbbell. So my leg has to be back and out of the way. And here, I like to use my fist only because sometimes that position with all that weight, my wrist doesn't always like it. But you can have an open palm like on the bench, flat, or you can have a wrist. There's different ways you can do it as long as you have a straight, rigid arm that's braced. And you'll notice here that I am using some body English, but it's controlled. It's not excessive. Now, one of the other reasons this is an accessory lift is because the extent to which that I would say that's controlled and not excessive is somewhat subjective. It's based on my experience as a lifter and a coach. So when I look at that, if I would look at a client doing that, I would say, okay, if I didn't specify strict rows, that is acceptable to me. That's an acceptable amount of English, a little bit of rotation, but not excessive. But this would not be a strict row. This would just be a regular dumbbell row. So I'm using a stretch reflex at the bottom and a little bit of body English there. And that's kind of just a snapshot example of a set 135 times 10. So that's the first thing we're going to look at. You can see that I lowered the weight to 95 pounds. These handles are 15 pounds each, and those are 10-pound plates. Even though they're of different sizes, they're all 10 pounds. I have a mishmash of plates acquired from different places at different times. So they're all 10-pound plates. This is 95 pounds. So I took 40 pounds off of the dumbbell so that I can demonstrate with a variety of different techniques in a way that was with a light enough weight that I can kind of just demonstrate it and, be silly if I needed to be silly. So we're going to show some different varieties of the dumbbell row here. So the first way, and if you go back and remember to the previous video, I used a stretch reflex and I used a little bit of body English. So let's start playing this and see what I do here. Get set up, start the first rep, and notice that I place the dumbbell down on the floor each rep. So it starts from the floor, which means it's a dead stop. So I'm not using a stretch reflex. But notice that in this variation, I also am required to use body English because to lean down that far, even if I wanted to do it strict, I couldn't really do it strict because look how twisted and rotated my torso is there, right? To highlight that a little bit more, right? Look here, right? See that rotation, right? I need to rotate my torso in order to get the full good range of motion and kind of even my body out. So going back to the video here, if we play it in slow-mo, you'll see it's not really possible. I have to use a little bit of English to actually do this right. And that's what I do here, but I do every rep from that full stop. Okay, let's watch again. And what happens next? Now here, I purposely hunch over. So if you look at my back here, you see that I'm quite rounded. And generally, and let's kind of go back to see where I was at before, right? Here you see I'm more or less flat. Again, is it perfectly, perfectly flat squeezed up? Well, it's going to depend on the part of the lift you catch me in. But basically, I have a flat extended back here for the most part. Colloquially speaking, not in the technical term of what we would call neutral spine, but colloquially we would say I have a flat back. Whereas if we go to where we were a moment ago, here, you see that I'm quite rounded and hunched over, especially up there. And even down in the lumbar area, letting myself round. And that's not what we want. The reason why is twofold. One, watch what happens when I do this. I can't really get a full range of motion. I'm kind of impeded by the hunch over from getting the same good full range of motion I did before. And in addition to just generally not looking like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, I want to get a full range of motion. What I also want to do is I want to use this to retract my scapula. Part of the end range of motion when you have that dumbbell up as high as you can get it close to you is you are training the lat, you're training the rear delt, you're getting even a little bit of tricep. There's also a scapular retraction, and the muscles that retract the scapula can work there. And we're leaving that out if we keep ourselves hunched over in significant thoracic flexion. You're not really going to be able to retract your scapula at the top, and you miss out training that part of the movement, those muscles as well. So we're trying to avoid that, in addition to the Hunchback of Notre Dame look, which is never cool. All right, so what Next, now I overextend. So I show what happens when you focus on overextension. And my head comes out of the frame here. What happens here, obviously, is I get really vertical. I focus so much on my overextension here. And maybe I'm not even overextended. I'm just exaggerating the vertical and the extension. I, again, focus so much on that, I don't get the full range of motion. So that's not what you want either. Let's go back to some normal reps. And here, again, back to contrast with some normal reps. Right? Normal spinal extension for the most part, again, not in the technical sense, but in the colloquial sense. And here, instead of doing dead stop, I show an example of like what I was doing before, where I'm using a stretch reflex and a little bit of English. Let's watch those last couple again, which stretch reflex and a little bit of English. And we can note here from this angle, what I mentioned before about your leg being far back out of the way. Now, these dumbbell handles are longer than most dumbbells. These are long. So most dumbbells won't be this long. But you still have to have your leg sufficiently out of the way. And now that you can see this angle, you can see the spread here, that this arm and this leg are fairly far apart. And that creates room for this dumbbell to come up without hitting me in the leg there. So that's what happens. That's what happens when you get your leg out of the way as opposed to not getting out of the way. You got to make sure it's far enough back or to the side or both. Okay, so that will wrap up this video, and we'll take a look at one more example of some things to do and not to do. The other arm with the same weight. So you see I'm here still at 95 pounds with a lighter weight for some examples. So first I show just some regular ones from this side again. And again, notice, let's go back. Notice I start in what we'll call, normal spinal extension. Again, not the technical term, but just colloquially speaking, roughly a flat back. But because I have to reach down to get the dumbbell from the floor, you see I do have some rotation, and I'm going to have to do a little bit of English, use a little bit of English to get that up. Now, on the subsequent reps, I can do them strict if I want to. I don't. I use a little bit of English for all the reps, starting from the floor. And you'll see I switched to doing what I was doing before, where I use a little bit of English, not starting from the floor like that with the stretch reflex. Okay, now I stop to demonstrate some of the wrong ways to do it. So I demonstrated on the other side some wrong postural ways to do it, allowing too much flexion or emphasizing too much extension, both of which take away from what we're trying to do, or too much of a vertical torso. In this case, this is the one that I see a lot of. People trying to use too much weight and using too much momentum. So again, exactly where the line is a little bit fuzzy, but that doesn't mean there isn't a line. It's kind of like age of driving. When should you be able to start driving? Well, of course, it depends where you live. In New York City, it makes sense to be a little older than it does in a rural Nebraska where people are driving tractors on the farms at 9 or 10 years old. Well, yeah, they can probably drive on those roads at 14 or 15, sure. But take most 14 or 15-year-olds in New York City, that's crazy, right? We don't want them to drive till they're a little older. But where exactly should the age of driving be? Well, everybody knows a 30-year-old should be able to drive, right? And nobody thinks that a 6-year-old should be able to drive. Exactly where the line is might be fuzzy. It might depend on the place. 15 here, 17 there. It's a little fuzzy right at the margin, but that doesn't mean there isn't a line. We all know that every 3-year-old in the world is too young to drive, and 30-year-old should definitely be able to drive. Defining the line is a little fuzzy. So what I'm going to show here is some examples of clearly egregious too much English. Now, where I see this a lot is just people trying to use more weight than they're capable of. And in the first example, I just overdo the English significantly. So let's watch that first. Boom. Just look at that. It's all English. And if you can't see that, then I don't know, you don't have what it takes to be a coach, right? Let's look at that again. Just the insane amount. I'm just heaving it up with my torso, and my arm is kind of coming along for the ride. I'm not strong enough to actually use that weight. Now, the next thing I see, and to be honest, if I'm being honest, the place I've seen this the most is among bodybuilders, and the place I've seen it the most is among female bodybuilders. So that's just my own experience. I don't know if it's always true. And when I say bodybuilders, I mean generally the physique competition circuit, anywhere from bikini to bodybuilding. People trying, and it's in general, why do people do it? People trying to use more weight because they have the reputation, doing it for the gram, and not only can they not do it properly with their own strength, and they have to use too much English, but even with all that English, they don't actually get anything like a good range of motion. So let's see what that looks like. Then we'll go back and watch it again in slow-mo and point some things out. I see this a lot. Something about doing this with 100-pound dumbbells. I see a lot of people, they want to use the hundreds and they end up doing this. So let's go back and look at that and look at what I mean by the criteria that they're not meeting. So let's go and slow-mo and look at the top of the movement. Okay, look at here. We're looking at the elbow joint. Look how little flexion there is in the elbow joint. My arm is almost straight, almost like it was all the way down here. So my elbow doesn't bend very much. So that joint isn't working. That's the bicep. What about the shoulder joint, right? Shoulder flexion is what is driving the lat work here, right? So how far does my shoulder flex? Well, that's a function of how far back my elbow goes. So how far back does my elbow go? Well, it doesn't even get close, right? If this is my shoulder joint here, my elbow doesn't even come close to meeting that red line, much less going past it, right? Never even gets close, right? So let's take a look at what I was doing before in some of these reps. Here, at the highest point, my elbow gets to my shoulder joint, more or less. Again, we're not measuring this with a goniometer and finding the angles, but more or less, I drive my elbow up to the point of my shoulder joint. So I'm getting a decent amount of shoulder flexion. That means I'm working the muscles that operate that joint, which are primarily the lat. You're also going to see some rear delt and some other stuff in that upper back to the back of the shoulder area. I'm getting a decent amount of work there. However, when I go to this, and the highest up my elbow gets, it doesn't even come close to crossing that, parallel line with my shoulder. I'm getting a lot less shoulder flexion, a lot less work in the lat. And if you see my elbow here, like I was pointing out before, this joint doesn't close. So let's look at what that looks like. Right, look how closed this joint is. Right, from here to here. This is a very closed joint. Whereas over here, when I'm being silly and mimicking that thing, we can see that that's a much more open joint. So I'm not getting the work on either of the joints there. And I see this a lot. I see it with guys trying to lift too much weight to impress someone or for the gram. I see it with women doing the same thing there. The hundreds, there's something magical about the hundreds, that people just want to use the hundreds and will do this kind of silly thing to use the hundreds. I'm not going to go out and say that both of these two kind of forms here, either the exaggerated English, well, no, that's correct. So here where I go to the exaggerated English that you see here, this heave-ho, and this partial thing, I'm not going to go out and say that there's never an appropriate place for that, but it's so rare in such a small percent of the population, probably only for very, very specific, specialized people doing something specific for a very specific, specialized goal, that it doesn't really apply to almost anybody that I've ever seen or ever coached. I can think of a few reasons why a super advanced physique competitor, bodybuilder would want to do it, or a super advanced powerlifter might want to do that, something like that. But for the most part, for the general lifter, for the general trainee, those things are never going to apply. And for the goals of most people, we can say definitively that that has crossed the line into like the 30-year-old that definitely needs to be able to drive and the 6-year-old that hasn't. We can say that something like that has crossed that line. So to wrap things up and finish them off, what we found is a set of very basic criteria that we can use to determine the dumbbell row. The start position is flexible. You can start either from a paused dead stop or you can use a stretch reflex. You are probably going to have to use a little bit of English to do it, although you could do it very strict if you wanted to. Most people use a little bit of English for those, and for stricter rows, do something like using a cable, where it lends itself better to being stricter if you want to do that. You could do it with a dumbbell too, however. The range of motion that we want, again, exactly the criteria of the range of motion is not as clear as something like a squat, where we have a lockout at the top and below parallel, crease of the hip below parallel to the top of the kneecap at the bottom. We have a clear, definitive place for the bottom, right? The arm has to be straight at the bottom, either the dumbbell touching the ground or else hanging, but the arm needs to be straight. But at the top, how far do you have to go for it to count? Well, there isn't exactly objective criteria. So we kind of looked at something that's clearly on the 6-year-old side of the line, and then we looked at a set that was clearly on the 30-year-old side of the line. Exactly where that line is, though, very hard to determine. It's a little bit fuzzy, it's a little bit gray, so there's some variation there. You can do them dead stop, you can do them with stretch reflex, you can do them with more English or less English, but there probably will be a little bit of English. But those are some of the variations, some of the variety, and I wanted to show that just to show an example of, even if you are acing your accessories, there is a little more variety in the way that you can do them compared to the way you're going to probably try to do a very, very repeatable version of your main lift, or at least the competitive or primary version of your main lift. So I just wanted to highlight that using the dumbbell row as an example, and also providing a little bit of basic instruction and criteria for the dumbbell row. So hopefully you found this video useful. Would love to hear your thoughts in the comments if you have questions or something that you disagreed with or didn't like or didn't think made sense. Let me know. I'll try to catch all the comments, and we'll see you next time.